I'll take- All right. Yeah, people are still trickling. Hello, everybody. So good to see you guys. Thank you for making the time to join me, join each other on this month's webinar topic. For those of you who joined last month, it was the first, what I'm calling the Fireside Chat webinar series. That was on psychedelic churches. And we had a really, really great discussion on that. Very, very robust. And a lot of the commentary afterwards, after my talk, was illuminating to say the least. Um, Psychedelic churches are really the Wild West of the psychedelic movement here in America. And there is quite a bit of nuance that goes along with them for sure. Just as it is with this topic, with addiction. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about addiction, the nature of addiction, what it is, the various kind of philosophical and scientific approaches to what it is, um, and various treatment modalities and options that surround addiction as we know it today. Of course, we'll be talking about the psychedelic influence on the treatment of addiction, which is something that's very, very near and dear to my heart. Um, as it is something I have a lot of experience with, So generally speaking, these fireside chats that I'm going to be doing every month, I'm trying to make them about something that I have a lot of experience with and can speak to with some form of uh, relatability or authenticity, so to speak. Um, I have been in recovery for substance abuse recovery since the late 90s. Um, I was a very low bottom addict. And since then, I have relapsed on my drug of choice more than once, but I am clean this time about 6 years, with the exception of psychedelic medicine work. Um, and, of all the modes, I guess all the I don't know, kind of origin stories around suffering, right? Addiction is the one for me that has the most potency inside of my soul. It's the one that has definitely caused the most damage within my life and those that I have hurt. And it's definitely been, I don't know, my cross to bear, so to speak. But, we all have forms of suffering, right? We all are prone to suffering. The first noble truth in Buddhism that Siddhartha Gautama came up with was that no matter who you are, no matter what class you belong to, or race, sex, um, we are all prone to suffering. And that is just an inescapable truth of being alive in this incarnation. How we treat that suffering, though, and the long periods that we can go without having to suffer with the aid of various practices and modalities to ease that suffering and to break through the darkness and into the light are indeed, um, I think that's really what the spiritual path is made of, right? I mean, it is great to be on a spiritual path that really connects us with the one, gets us in touch with God, and really feeling kind of a connection to something other than ourselves and inside of our hearts. But a lot of time those can be kind of lofty ideas. On a day-to-day basis, how do we use our spirituality? How do we use our practice? And in this case, how do we use the insights that we gain from psychedelic mysticism and psychedelic journey work and apply it to our daily lives, to ease that suffering, to remind us that we are whole and that we are complete, that we are authentic, that we are worth saving, that we have something to offer the world where we can be in touch with our own voice and soar beyond our potential. Um, and, with psychedelics, in and of themselves, that can sometimes be a very tricky thing to do, right? Because the psychedelic experience is it is waning, you know. You do have to come down, you know. You do have to find a way to take those, very deep and profound and mystically oriented altered states and those profound little nuggets of wisdom that you get in that space, and you do have to find a way to distill them and bring them into your life, you know. And since addiction in and of itself, kind of if you look at addiction in a vacuum, um, that is a behavior, it is an action that can be very easy to slip right back into, right? And, I just want to kind of preface this before we talk about some kind of um, specific definitions and philosophical overviews around addiction. When I'm speaking about addiction, I'm not talking just about substance abuse. Um, that is the form of addiction that I have the most experience with. It is the one that, I really deeply understand on a deeply personal level, as well as also an intellectual level too. I've done quite a bit of study around it formally. But addiction comes in so many manifestations in today's world. I think perhaps now probably more manifestations than ever before, right? Um, I mean, there are support groups for social media addiction. There are support groups for smartphone addiction. I mean, it is a very wide-ranging condition that affects people in so many areas of their life. I mean, the most common forms, obviously, are substance abuse, eating disorders, sex addiction, gambling. Um, yeah, I mean, what else? I mean, there are so many, right? Um, and sometimes in some ways, I do think that I think most people who are alive today have some form of kind of addictive imbalance that could maybe qualify as being addicted to, you know. Um, it's for some people, it can manifest in, say, perhaps an addiction of health and wellness, going to the gym and being very, very obsessive and compulsive around that. That can cause a little bit of imbalance, but it can also lead to a very healthy body, mind, and spirit as well. So, I mean, there are forms of this imbalance that don't always skew towards the negative. However, I think the key word is imbalance, right? Um, so yeah, let's talk about various definitions of addiction before we get into the psychedelic portion of this discussion. And also, I'm going to talk about the 12 steps and the 12-step kind of connection to psychedelics and the origin stories around that, which I think is very, very fascinating. So thank you all for being here. Really, really appreciate it. It's a great turnout. As I said before the tape was rolling, I accidentally sent the wrong link out last week. So I'm so glad you guys got the right link and clicked on that and didn't click on the San Francisco Psychedelic Society's link, which would have been very unfortunate. So sorry about that. Thank you so much for coming. I do see some familiar faces here and some new faces, and I hope to get to know all of you guys more. And after I talk too, we will have discussion. And when we do get into that, just reminding you now, try to use the hand raising feature if you can, so we're not talking over each other, right? Usually the best way to go. Um, so, these are not all of the major perspectives around addiction. I think, these are a few of them. But let's start with science. Let's start with the neuroscientific model around addiction, which is often referred to as the disease model, right? And the disease model around addiction has become widely accepted and it has disseminated into 12-step culture, into treatment culture, and so much so that even like on a fundamental level, like what's a good example? Like your health insurance, right? If you have decent health insurance, it might cover substance abuse treatment because it views it as a disease. Now, we can debate what addiction is later, but let's just talk about it for a little bit. Um, the National Institute on Drug Abuse defines addiction as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. Again, this is just around substance abuse, but you can fill in the blank if addiction is manifesting in another area of life that you're curious about. Um, and the one thing about this model is brain imaging in fMRIs does show that addictive substances with people that are hardwired in certain neuronal networks and disorders in their pathways, their neural pathways, that taking certain drugs does kind of disrupt the reward system around dopamine, um, specifically in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system. So, what that means in the simplest terms, and I can speak for myself in this, when I take certain drugs and that drug starts to wear off, my first impulse is more, right? More. And that is something I learned at a very, very early age that I was predisposed to. Um, and I will say, as far as I am concerned in my own story, that that is a reality in my own physiology, right? I don't think addiction is a disease, period. But I do think the scientific element is something to talk about. I have made peace with the idea that I cannot use heroin successfully, no matter how much work I've done spiritually or on my trauma, so to speak. It just does not agree with my system. So the neuroscientific kind of disease model, um, I think in some ways, though, kind of the downsides to it is it kind of over pathologizes the behavior. Um, and, some critics might say that it neglects kind of social context and agency, reducing it just to a very kind of overly simplified reality around neurochemistry, right? And I do think that is a fair critique of it for sure. Again, that's why I don't think we can just say addiction is any one singular thing, right? But moving on past the disease model, great philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, Gabriel Marcel, Bruce Alexander, um, kind of have a more existential philosophical view around what addiction is. Um, yeah, Jean-Paul Sartre kind of referred to it as a bad faith coping mechanism, a way to flee from freedom or responsibility. I think, I mean, Sartre wrote an awfully long time ago, and in today's modern world, um, I don't know if that's completely appropriate, but I think there's something to it, especially around this idea of fleeing from responsibility. Addiction was certainly that for me. It kept me kind of in a liminal state around life, one where I didn't really have to answer or report to anyone, and I just kind of barely existed. So some of those philosophers will refer to it as addiction as a symptom of existential dread or kind of a social malaise. Um, so one way to look at it. My least favorite kind of model around addiction is the moral choice model. And that is the one I would push back on the most. That becoming an addict of any kind is a failing of moral virtue, in that it means you have been programmed or warped in your mind around around your parents, the socioeconomic strata in which you grew up, or whatever the case may be. And it's just a moral failing. And you choose these addictive behaviors because you're not a good person. You know? So, and yes, I've heard of psychedelics in recovery, and we will talk about that later. So I definitely don't think it's that. I don't think addicts of any kind are bad people, as the 12-step model goes. We are not bad people trying to get good. I will absolutely agree with that. Um, and then kind of moving on into the psychological behavioral model. And that core idea suggests addiction is a learned behavior reinforced by reward mechanisms. So, that's often rooted in cognitive psychology. B.F. Skinner wrote a lot about it. Addictive patterns that emerge through classical conditioning, associating cues with pleasure and kind of conditioning around the reinforcement of use. Um, CBT therapists approaches treating addiction by challenging our thought patterns and our cues and our reinforcement contingencies and things like that. And the basic premise of that is that addiction can be unlearned with new conditioning, coping strategies, and awareness triggers. Um, I don't entirely agree with that. I partially agree with that. Um, I do agree that once you kind of break free from your addiction and get into whatever form of recovery is working for you, that you do need to learn some new behaviors that are healthy for you, that aren't kind of your default knee-jerk reaction to return to the drug or return to the spending or the gambling or whatever it is. Um, but I do think that also takes a lot of work as well to get to that place. But certainly, I think that's part of kind of the stew that goes into recovery. I think psychedelics have been very powerful tools for me and are very powerful tools for showing people who suffer from addiction that um, the behaviors that they engage in on a daily basis aren't optimal for ideal living conditions, aren't optimal for kind of, really living in a higher vibrational form of self, you know. Um, I have definitely seen that through my work in psychedelics, Um, In my book, I refer to it as the cosmic mirror. And what I mean by that is that psychedelics um, have kind of like this unbiased cosmic mirror quality to them that shows you. Um, can someone mute, please, if you're not muted? I will do that. Okay, thanks. Psychedelics are brutally honest, is what I mean. They will show you parts of yourself that are inescapable truths that you have to come to terms with. And it is very hard to disassociate from that and to compartmentalize your existence in that way when on these medicines. I personally find that to be very rewarding. I think that's, kind of sometimes it's sort of like God's loving kick in the ass to kind of show me parts of myself that I normally am loath to take a look at, or I don't really strive to take a look at on an ongoing basis. It takes a lot more work in my waking state. And when I kind of just see that projected back to me, in a very loving way. I think the cosmic mirror is kind of a really beautiful metaphor for how psychedelics introduce our shadow side into our consciousness in ways where we can find mechanisms to be in balance with our shadow side rather than completely dismissing it, pushing it away, saying it doesn't exist, rather than compartmentalizing it. But just shows us, hey, we are a multitude, in the IFS model, we are a multitude of parts, we are a multitude of selves. There's a lot that goes into our existence, and our personalities and our egos. And sometimes the shadowy things is where the juicy stuff lies, right? Um, and addiction can certainly be part of that. It's by far my most pronounced shadow side, but the behaviors that surrounded like my addiction, um, this is where the psychological behavioral model, I think, kind of comes into play in kind of a correct way. Um, a lot of the behaviors that existed within my addiction are not behaviors that I engage in outside of my addiction, but learning to reconcile those and make peace with them and find new strategies for coping, certainly is a long, ongoing process. Um, you know, and then, we can get into the biopsychosocial model, which says that addiction arises from interaction among biological, psychological, and social factors. I think that also plays into a lot of the other models that we've already talked about, philosophical, and perhaps even the disease model as well to some extent. Um, you know, but the one, the next chapter that I would really, really talk about is the spiritual model, the spiritual disconnection model. While so many of these other philosophical definitions and scientific definitions around addiction, I think, do are very valid. Um, and I think nuggets from all of them factor into the whole. Um, but what you often don't see in a lot of scientific literature, and psychological literature around addiction is a spiritual disconnection, right? The God-sized hole in our heart, as Jamie Wheal would say. Um, and when you do have so much, when you are in your ego to the point of being completely disconnected from something outside of yourself, whether you want to call it God, spirit, love, compassion, beauty, the one, whatever it is you want to call it, Jesus, Krishna, the Buddha, the universe, the sun. Um, I do think having an overly fixated relationship with your ego does lead to behaviors that can be very self-indulgent, like addiction, So I think that is really the most pinpointed thing that I will say around why lack of spiritual connection is often so associated with people who become addicts, because you're trapped in the ego, you're trapped in the self, you're trapped in that cycle of wanting to escape, to numb, and to feed the base vibrational, the lowest vibrational parts of yourself, not the highest vibrational parts of yourself. And spiritual connection can do a lot to really fill those holes. And I think that is perhaps, in my opinion anyway, the greatest attribute and quality of the 12-step world, right? Bill Wilson, who started AA, he also saw that as well, which is why spirituality is such a core part of the 12-step model. And it's even mentioned in the steps. Um, and I do think that there was definitely something to that for sure. But going into the 12-step model, let's talk about that for a little bit. I am just going to share something with you guys, and we will get into it. Let me just This. Um, oh yeah. I'll talk about this at the end, but my psychedelic studies intensive starts again December 10th. Um, so Bill Wilson is the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1934, Bill Wilson was a stockbroker in New York City, struggling with severe alcoholism. At the time, when you admitted anyway that you wanted treatment for alcoholism and you were submitting yourself for treatment to alcoholism, the options were few. They were few, you know. Most likely you'd be put in the sanitarium or in a part of the hospital that they didn't really know what to do with you, where they didn't really know what to do with you, um, and kind of just treated it more like an insane asylum. But there was a place called Towns Hospital in New York City that Bill Wilson just happened to stumble upon and end up there. Um, And there they were doing something called the belladonna cure. And this treatment involved a mix of, hold on, somebody's coming in. Sorry, guys, somebody came in. Hold on one second. How's it coming? Let's go. Sorry about that. Every time someone comes in, I have to stop. Um, the treatment involved primarily datura, which is a pretty strong psychedelic, and henbane as well. And the idea was to purge the body of its toxins and induce kind of a psychedelic experience that might shock the person into sobriety. Now, keep in mind that back then in 1934, the idea of a psychedelic experience was so esoteric that it had no frame of reference, right? It literally had no frame of reference to it. So for most people who experience that, and you can read actually, it's online. You can read the accounts of other people who had the belladonna treatment in the 30s. And for them, it was kind of a nightmare because they had no frame of reference for what the psychedelic experience was, you know, so they didn't know how to surrender to it. There was no modern literature on what psychedelics were, and to them it was just an absolute nightmare. Um, Bill W., however, he did the belladonna experience, and he later described it as a great white light and a profound sense of peace and connection to God. And after that experience, it led him to write the 12 steps, which is an incredible thing. As a result of that experience, supposedly chapter 4, How It Works, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, was written in like 4 hours, you know, and the 12 steps in like 45 minutes. And then he went on to write the rest of the chapter. So kind of an extraordinary story. So AA, you know, started in the 30s, went on for a while, but you know, when Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in the 30s, um, you know, one great thing about Albert Hofmann is that he immediately saw the psychotherapeutic potential of acid. So there couldn't have been a better chemist to have discovered LSD 25. You know, yes, he was just a chemist, but he was also the perfect recipient and messenger for the power of it. And he wrote extensively about it and really had this drug on his shelf at Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland that he thought could be a very useful psychotherapeutic agent. And by the 50s, Dr. Humphrey Osmond came along and tried LSD for himself. Well, he actually tried mescaline first and also gave guys like Aldous Huxley mescaline as well, which is the inspiration for the Doors of Perception. But after he tried LSD, he thought that there could be a connection to LSD in the treatment of alcoholism. Um, by inducing a powerful transformative experience similar to a spiritual awakening that was already kind of in the vernacular as it relates to alcoholism through the 12 steps and the work that Bill W. was doing, right? So, beginning 1953, Humphrey Osmond and his team administered LSD to, it was quite a few. The sample size was pretty big at the study, um, and the results were pretty extraordinary. A single dose, often about 200 to 400 mics, pretty big, right? And the goal was to trigger a pretty intense psychological and emotional experience. But it also contained what we refer to now as preparation and integration as well, and therapy settings before and during, in the middle, and afterwards as well, right? Kind of just an extraordinary thing. Um, and if you've taken my course, I know some of you have been in here, have taken my course, um, know that have seen the LSD handbook. Um, hold on. Um, the handbook by Humphrey Osmond and his team. And you'll see something that is so extraordinary in it, and that it really is these LSD experiments in the 50s for alcoholism is really the foundational model for psychedelic assisted therapy as we know it today. Um, yeah, it's an extraordinary thing, and you will read it, and it has so many beautiful nuggets around spiritual awakenings and mystical realizations, and how these alcoholics confronted their inner demons and really got in touch with God, and the therapy sessions that happened in between that were really kind of pretty compassionate and really supportive, kind of, if you kind of have an idea of what therapy was like in the 50s, and then you read Humphrey Osmond's guide to the therapeutic sessions, it's kind of the complete opposite of that. Way, way, way ahead of its time. The point being that psychedelics have been linked with addiction for quite a while, right? So back to Bill W. I'm just going to stay on this slide because every time somebody comes in, I have to quit. Um, so Bill Wilson got word of what Humphrey Osmond was doing, and got very curious about LSD himself. He did LSD 5 times under the supervision of Dr. Sidney Cohen, who was one of Humphrey Osmond's proteges. And he said, a sense of being lifted out of myself, of a returning confidence in God. It is generally acknowledged fact in spiritual development that ego reduction makes the influx of God's grace possible. The egocentric problem of the alcoholic is much the same as everyone else's, and so it may be that LSD will help alcoholics where other methods fail. Kind of extraordinary, right? And 20 years before that, Bill already wrote the steps 3 and 11, which we'll talk about. We made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So when you go back and look at some of Bill Wilson's feelings around his LSD experiences, for me, what I immediately pick up from that is how, just talking about Bill himself as an individual, he was a real seeker. You know, he did not believe, even up until that point, that AA, his brainchild, was the be all end all of all recovery solutions. He thought that there could be more, and that using all the tools at our disposal was a wise way to go. Um, but you also see how these early kind of connections to LSD and alcoholism really were based on the spiritual experience, which ties very well into the 12 steps as they exist already. But what happened, and as the story as I understand it anyway, is that Bill Wilson's wife, Lois, um, started getting a little freaked out at Bill's love of LSD. And after his fifth journey, started pushing back on him a little bit. She was very involved in Alcoholics Anonymous herself and created Al-Anon. And she did not see it as compatible and really encouraged Bill to push back on it and to kind of step away from what was happening there. And then in the early 60s, when a lot of the work at Harvard was going on with Timothy and Ramdas and Richard and Ralph Metzner, the already the perception around LSD was starting to change, and it did not seem to fit within conventional wisdom for the 12-step model, right? Which is really a shame. It really, really is a shame because it started off with such promising results, right? And then kind of just went by the wayside. Um, but, the 12-step model, as kind of we understood it, grew exponentially. From 1938 until 1958 was kind of one big, acceleration. And then from like around 63 to 73 was kind of just a massive explosion of 12-step attendance. Narcotics Anonymous was also created, as well as other 12-step fellowships as well, who just borrowed the 12 steps from AA and applied them to whatever affliction was going on there. Um, and it accelerated at such a pace that and with some success in a lot of ways, that it really helped to shape the modern treatment model as we understand it today. Nixon's war on drugs in the late 60s and early 70s, which is really the foundational model for the war on drugs as we understand it today, really did start to demonize drug users, right? That was a really huge line in the sand. I mean, it was already happening with Ansinger and earlier as well, but that was a real hard line in the sand that criminalized drug possession and most drug use. But ironically, what came with a lot of Nixon's drug war reforms was treatment as well, was federally sanctioned, federally funded treatment options as well. So while it was mostly bad, it wasn't all bad. He did see and was kind of convinced that many addicts and alcoholics do deserve a shot at treatment, and it did create kind of the medical establishment for treatment as we understand it. But by then, the cord was already ripped around the connection between psychedelics and the treatment for alcoholism and addiction. So by then, the treatment model really started to become a factory of just 28-day kind of detox models, maybe longer term residential models afterwards, using 12 steps and maybe some cognitive behavioral therapy. And, to mixed results, right? Um, and all of these years later, that really still is kind of the default kind of treatment model for substance abuse, especially. Um, but, I think when we look at today's psychedelic movement and all of its successes of the last 20 years, well, let's say maybe the last 15 years, especially, I think the reinduction and kind of shining the light again on psychedelics' potential to combat addiction and to help treat the addict has been one of the great successes that we've seen, not just in peer review scientific studies as we see with ibogaine treating opioid dependence as well, but with a huge expansion of psychedelic recovery communities like Psychedelics in Recovery, PIR, and psychedelic recovery as well. Psychedelic recovery uses the 12 steps as the model. Psychedelics in Recovery does not. But what happened there, right, was that because of the huge and rising popularity of 12-step culture for addiction treatment became just so synonymous with what treatment looks like in America. Many people who were having still very favorable and positive relationships with psychedelics were jettisoned from 12-step culture. They were pushed out. They were not synonymous. They were told they couldn't be there. That's a drug. You relapsed. You're out. You can't be here if you're still using in that way. Well, you can be here, but you can't count your recovery or your sobriety or your clean time. So it really started kind of to create just a dissonance in that relationship. The zero abstinence model is really the kind of de facto standard for modern treatment approaches for especially around substance abuse. When we start getting into other forms of addiction as well, it gets a little bit more nuanced than that. But around substance abuse, um, and that becomes, for some people who have found, such deep and profound internal awakenings and found their inner light to be really just illuminated so beautifully by psychedelics, that becomes a very difficult culture to stay a part of, right? Um, but going back to that short little deck that I presented, to me, the irony of it, though, is that I think intentional ceremonial psychedelic use, and what I mean by intentional and ceremonial is, well, just that, literally, not often, done with great intent and centeredness and deliberation and ceremonial. Meaning, you're not just dumping a bunch of acid at a dead show, that you're really taking it seriously and engaging in some form of ritual and self-care and ceremony and respect for the medicine. I think it is one of the great embodiments of the third and 11th step, um, which to me, it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you use psychedelics in that way, what better way is there to improve your conscious contact with God and to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand it to be, right? No matter what method you use. But I think psychedelics are such a beautiful, beautiful addition to that. It certainly has been with me, 100%. Um, I do add a little bit of caution to it in that, this is my opinion. Um, but I believe that if you have been dealing with substance abuse issues and you're having a difficult time getting stable, that, perhaps turning to psychedelics right away might not be the best idea. Um, some may disagree with me on that, but I do think that most successful psychedelic use can benefit from some stability in your life. So, if your basic kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs aren't met as a result of drug addiction, if you don't have any place to live, your housing is unstable, food unstable, are facing law enforcement issues, have tremendous health problems as a result of your addiction. Um, I already said law enforcement. I think whatever jumping into the psychedelic sphere might not kind of be the best time for that. So I do think the relationship is very tricky. Um, However, that said, turning to the Ibogaine model for a second, the stories, I have not used ibogaine for the sake of opiate detox myself. I mean, I've tried it, but not for that intention. Um, Many people are finding the ibogaine entryway as the starting point of their recovery journey, going to these amazingly beautifully run and curated ibogaine clinics, which fortunately are not in America because it's still the legality is still being worked out. There are some underground ibogaine clinics here and some ibogaine churches in America, but for the most part, clinics like Beyond, for instance, in Mexico, are amazing places to start your recovery journey, and that begins with a psychedelic experience. Not only does it purge you from your opiate use disorder, but it also begins with a very intense, sometimes harrowing, but beautiful psychedelic experience that really starts you off on the journey, so to speak. Um, Ibogaine has a 90% success rate with disrupting opiate use disorder. So that means for people who are on opiates, it works 90% of the time in stopping the opiate cycle. Um, and what happens afterwards, and how long people stay off of the opiates afterwards. I mean, those statistics vary, of course, but a 90 percentile success rate is extraordinary, you know. And the fact that we stumbled onto that is a wonderful thing. So ibogaine, of course, we can't say enough about the validity and efficacy of that method for sure. And that does start with the psychedelic experience, But otherwise, yeah, I do think that the relationship between psychedelics and your own ongoing recovery, growth, and spiritual wellness is something to do slowly, patiently, intentionally, very deliberately. And it's a really big choice to make. So if you are a person that is considers themselves to be in recovery, and you maybe have what sober time or recovery time, sobriety, and you're measuring it in months or years, and as they do in 12-step cultures, and you're thinking about um, revisiting or introducing psychedelics. That is a choice only you can make, but I certainly would not, completely advise against it. But the one thing I would say is that talk to someone, do it cautiously, and do it very, very intentionally, and work with somebody who can really guide you through the experience and take you to um, that place. Um, I have found that using psychedelics, even with years of clean time, it can still be a very, very harrowing thing as it relates to the nature of addiction. I still will take psychedelics today and have, certain parts of my past come up to the surface, parts that happened years and years, decades ago, even stories that I'm revisiting even today that I thought I'd already processed, and they come up and they kind of rear their head again and show you that they still need to be dealt with and unearth certain little attachments to that trauma, and how that trauma is affecting my life, my body, my imbalance, as it were. So, the point of me telling that is that it is a big deal. If you are in recovery and you are introducing psychedelics, it is a really big thing. It can be very, very rewarding. But like I said earlier, one of the great kind of offshoots of today's psychedelic renaissance is there is so much community out there that is in the same boat as you are. So much community. And I think because of that, the support networks out there for people who find themselves to be in that predicament are available. The psychedelics and recovery meetings meet online regularly, um, and are very, very easy to find, and they're run by really beautiful people. Um, so, so yeah. So, as I discussed at the beginning, addiction is a very, very complicated um, disorder. Sometimes I don't even know what to call it. You know, um, is it a disorder? Is it a disease? Is it a condition? Is it an imbalance? Is it a spiritual disconnection? Um, it's all of the above. But, for lack of better language, it's a very, very complicated addiction, very, very complicated disorder. There are many, many elements that go into it. Like I said, for speaking for myself, I know the neuroscientific model and the way my brain is wired. That is certainly one element of it. It's not all of it. Um, and Gabor Mate talks so much about how unprocessed childhood trauma and disconnection can also lead to addiction. I think that's also part of it. Um, I think, yeah, spiritual disconnection, obviously, huge part of it. I think the learned behaviors around it, especially in early addiction, when you're first getting into it and you just fall into the patterns of it, are also part of it. So it's kind of a really complicated thing. And recovery full recovery where you're really, really wanting to change your life and shed that addiction, it takes a lot of work. It takes more than just any one method to it. Yeah, it takes more than just psychedelics, more than just going to meetings, more than just therapy. It really takes a very well-rounded and holistic approach to changing your life. No one thing is going to cure you from addiction, but a multitude of things done with intention, honesty, vulnerability can certainly get you through it. And I think psychedelics, it's something that we can't ignore. Um, I will share just before we open it up one last little tidbit around using psychedelics in 12-step culture. I'm just going to kind of tell on myself a little bit, just for the sake of making the point, because I get asked this question a lot. I still consider myself to be in recovery. I still consider myself to be a member of Narcotics Anonymous. Um, NA saved my life. I won't ever deny that. Some of my best friends are still in NA. I've known them for 25, 27 years now. I've known them forever. Some of the closest people in my life. The fact that I do macrodoses of psychedelics 2 or 3 times a year to me is nobody's business, in those fellowships. And for me, it is something that works for me. It is just a part of the equation and my ongoing kind of recovery, personal wellness routine that works for me. Um, I don't talk about it when I go to those rooms, but if you've heard me speak or read my book, you obviously know. And I just choose to, I can't meet them where they're at. You know, if the fellowships want to meet me where I'm at, I think that is kind of their choice. But I do see it changing a lot, which is a very interesting thing. In the last few years, I have seen a tremendous shift in 12-step culture around the tolerability around psychedelics. I get more and more people who are deep in 12-step fellowships who come knocking on my door very quietly, going, "Can you tell me more? I think I'm curious. I've read so much." So the culture is changing for sure. And I wrote about this a lot in my book, but how can you say going to see a shaman in Peru to do ayahuasca is a relapse when taking Xanax from your prescribing doctor isn't? How can you possibly say that one is okay and one isn't? To me, that is just the arrogance of the scientific method that doctors are some kind of medical authority on our lives, but seeing a shaman to take another kind of medicine to give you spiritual insight is not okay. So those are the black and white isms that I'm very passionate about erasing. There needs to be nuance. There needs to be subjectivity to it. You know, it's a complicated issue. And like I said, I don't think all newcomers should just run to a psychedelic church and take a bunch of mushrooms. It's a delicate thing, but there is nuance to it. Yeah. So, all right. I've talked for a long time. Does anyone have anything to say? Questions, comments, otherwise? And R. And you're muted, just so you know.
Yes, hi. My
Hi.
name's Anne, and I'm a psychonaut in recovery. Thank you very much for the chat, Zach. I really enjoyed it, and I completely agree with pretty much everything you said, particularly on the spiritual quest. I'm also a member of AA and was a member of NA, but I couldn't share about my experience with psychedelics for fear of being pushed out. I've been sacked by my sponsor, told me I was not sober because I microdosed. So I discovered psychedelics in recovery, And I think it's the importance of a community to integrate, and not just the psychedelic society here in London that I attend frequently, because people are not addicts and they don't understand the spiritual quest I am following.
Mm.
It's a different type of quest. And I've seen examples of friends of mine in NA who have tried to pursue the route of psychedelics on their own, and it had almost the reverse effect of what you were describing. Instead of ego deflation, there was an ego inflation,
Oh, interesting.
where all of a sudden
Mm.
they become almighty, all powerful.
Mm.
They are sponsored by their mushrooms. Their mushrooms talk to them and they become unteachable.
Mm.
And they go off on a tangent. And I've got three examples of that, and two ended up relapsing and in rehab. So
Mm.
I think the importance of community to integrate,
Yeah,
Gabor Mate said the antidote of addiction is connection.
yeah,
And having that group to connect, whether it's a 12-step program like PIR or another form, I think gathering groups is one of them. There's another one called Shukruna,
yeah,
for people in recovery who do pursue step 3 and step 11 in a different way. And even clinical trials now at Imperial College are trying to get some of peer support within the trial, because they've started to understand that the psychedelic on its own and the psychedelic experience, the awakening on its own is not enough if you don't have a community around you to help you integrate that. And that's a point I wanted to make, because I've seen the opposite happen if
yeah.
it's not the right setting for integration afterwards. And I'm complete. Thank you.
No, I love that. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. This brings up the Stan Grof non-specific amplifier thing, um, which basically means, psychedelics can magnify any part of the individual, even the addict part of the individual. They can be non-specific amplifiers. Absolutely. And I have seen that as well. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. The importance of community and around integration, not just in addiction, but around integration is absolutely vital. And thanks for those stories. Important to see both sides, no doubt. Paula and then Trip.
Hi, Zach. I'm going to keep my camera off if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I got so much out of it. I really appreciated you taking us through the history. It reminds me of a seminar that I attended at the MAPS conference this past summer in Denver, where David Lee presented on addiction psychedelic research
Mm.
being systematically erased. And if anybody's curious about that, I might drop the link in the chat here because it's up on the virtual MAPS page to watch his presentation. He also walked us through and probably taught, people that had never ever known. And you added some other details that were not in David's presentation, which I think both of y'all should combine and make a masterclass. So if you hadn't thought of that idea, I would reach out to him. But the other thing that I am curious to know is just thinking about health statistics and what I hope that when you do this presentation again, I would be curious to see some slides on co-occurrences. I'm a person that lives with a co-occurrence substance use and mental illness
Ah,
and in long-term recovery. And we know that the co-occurrence of just from the national survey on drugs is that according to the last one, that more than half of drug users
yeah,
have one serious mental illness.
yeah.
And so when speaking about psychedelics and then the use of, that modality for the treatment of alcoholism, I think careful attention, at least I'm grateful that I have given it to myself, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, that I've encompassed the holistic approach of not just my addiction, but what else. So for me, it turned out to be complex PTSD, and then using, just coming up with a treatment plan. That sounds very clinical. I don't mean it to be that, but just coming up with like what's best for Paula all the way around in all these dimensions that you're talking about. I really, really appreciate. I work in the health coaching field. Really appreciated that you talked about the piece about holistic, because another piece about this too is, and you mentioned Stan Groff's breath work. I've done holotropic breath work twice already. That is something also to share with individuals too, that you can have, for example, these breakthrough psychedelic experiences without having any medicine in your body, but just
Yeah.
using your own natural medicine. And so yeah, just some mindfulness around those topics too, and just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you so much for holding this space. Really appreciate you.
Of course, and thank you, Paula, for that. And yeah, and I think that the co-occurrence numbers are much higher than 50%, in my opinion. I've been through treatment 3 times. I
Yep.
I've been homeless and lived on Skid Row, which is in Los Angeles, which is basically an open market for addiction and mental health disorders. I lived there for almost 3 months, and I think it's much, much higher. Um, I certainly learned about myself coming into treatment that my addiction or whatever's going on with me isn't just that, that I do in fact suffer from, well, suffer, have an affliction with some other issues as well. So yeah, I will happily pull those stats next time. And thank you for that. While others are talking, if you can just put in the title of that talk into the chat, I'd appreciate that. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
going to do that right now. Thank you
thank
so
you.
much, Zach.
Yeah. Trip.
Hi. All right. First of all, thanks for having this. This has been great so far. Secondly, so I'm almost 8 years sober from cocaine now, thanks to mainly visions from DMT.
Nice.
Um, and when I was initially using DMT, it was just one other recreational drug to me, just something that I had access to that I wanted to do for fun. And over a period of like 2 months, I had these visions and quickly learned that this is not a recreational drug. And the visions just basically showed me what my life would be like if I did not get sober. And so I did, and it was still it was challenging. I relapsed over the next few months and all that. But once I did get sober, I remembered kind of like running back to a lot of my friends who were still in cocaine addiction and being like, hey, you got to try this, and it'll make you quit cocaine. And of course, like, that was like their response is not what I was expecting. And one guy even said, if that'll make me quit cocaine, then I am never going to try that. And so then, I stopped doing that. But later on, a friend of mine, which I shared DMT with, he, after us sitting together a few weekends with it, he even told me that, he's like, I was an atheist, and he's like, now, he's like, after doing DMT, he's like, I'm not saying that there is a God, but I think that there might be a real possibility that there is a God. And that kind of like, I didn't know he was an atheist, but it kind of brought me back to the idea of like, well, I had developed a spiritual connection with God through DMT, but it was after I got sober. I was more
Hmm.
thankful to God for making me want to get sober, because that was a real challenge for me, as I just never wanted to until
Yeah.
DMT made me want to. But then I thought back to my other friends, and I was like, well, what, like, if you were to tell somebody like try this DMT or so whatever psychedelic, it'll make you spiritual. I feel like most people who are not spiritual would have that same like, well, I'm never going to do it then if it's going to make me believe in a God.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to get your opinion on like, what do you think of all this? Like, with when we are using psychedelics as a treatment for drug addiction, and we're using the spiritual aspect of them at the same time, um, like I see that has a place for people who are already spiritual, but it is going to turn a lot of people away. And in fact, I have a friend of mine who was in drug addiction, and specifically would not stop talking about how much he did not like the addiction treatment programs that pushed
Yeah.
specifically Jesus on you.
Yeah. I get it, man. No, it's a very valid question. And thanks, Trip. Well, the first part, I will say, which you said something really important. I do think that recovery, well, especially around substance abuse, it starts with having, you got to want to, you know. I do believe that. And that is a 12-stepism that I do believe in. Oh, you know, you have to have a willingness. You've got to want to do it. You know, that's why, in my experience, rarely have I seen interventions work. You know, if people don't want to get clean or sober, they're not going to, you know, no matter how many people surround them. And any intervention that I've been a part of has failed because of that. So yeah, you do have to want to. Yeah, but I mean, I deal with that a lot in my session work, people who are spiritual materialists and really have a total aversion to God and kind of come to me and they're like, "Oh God, you're the Ram Dass guy. Like, are you going to push like, you know, all this Hare Krishna shit on me?" You know, and people come in very closed around that. And yeah, you know, Trip, I kind of soften the language, you know, especially around like DMT. Like, I would never, if somebody is, you know, firmly atheist, I would just say, hey, you know, not even invite that language into it. Like, oh, you're going to take DMT and see the face of God. I would be like, well, you know, well, who knows what can happen? You know, a lot of people do have tremendous spiritual experiences. Other people, you know, see a lot of beautiful shapes and colors and just, you know, keep your mind open for whatever you want to experience, you know. But yeah, if you come into it saying, with any psychedelic, saying, wow, this you're going to see the face of God here, and this is what connected me to spirituality for people who have no desire for that. It probably will turn them off. So I think it's more just sort of about language um, and how you welcome people in. You know, I find myself, I get a little bit too like overzealous, you know, too much of a zealot around certain psychedelic experiences. And people invite people into the space and they end up not getting that. And they're like, I thought you told me I was going to see the face of God. I didn't see that. So it goes both ways, man. I don't know. It's complicated. I would just kind of use language that's just more inviting and welcoming and kind of, hey, this is a choose your own adventure method, you know, even if you don't believe in God, just keep an open mind and see what happens, you know. Yeah. But thanks, Trip. Thanks for coming and good to see you again. Ethan will be the last one before we wrap it up.
Thank you, Zach. I just really appreciate you putting this together. I was in the the Fireside Chat last month too, so I thank you for doing this. These are really cool. Just kind of had a question here, maybe wanted your opinion too on a broader topic. But so it seems I've been in quite a few of it's these psychedelic Zoom recovery meetings where people have had a transformation in their life. That's the huge kind of a constant is everybody has a different road of how they may have got there, but there's a huge catalyzing change that does happen with these medicines in our life. So, I mean, I've had these experiences. I've been going on with this for 9 years to where my first DMT experience was 9 years ago. And that was my first introduction to psychedelics altogether was DMT. I started with that.
Mm,
And then I went with LSD and then I went with mushrooms. So I had kind of I felt like it was like a reverse intro instead of maybe, mushrooms is kind of a little bit gentler, LSD and then DMT. It was like
yeah, you went the opposite way.
reverse
Yeah,
order.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And so in learning this and having to have this, because it's kind of difficult to integrate the DMT experiences, they were very profound and very difficult. So as I kind of did these other experiences and then heard everybody else's experiences and kind of had a narration going of my own, the way that I have been able to adapt this in my own recovery. I've been going on recovery for 4 years with no alcohol,
mm,
and what it kind of seems to me is that it becomes this ongoing consciousness of turning the bad into good in your life,
mm,
changing the energies, the negative energies into positive energies, and it becomes this alchemical process that I found. It's this alchemy, and
yeah,
it's this process that I've called entheogenic alchemy
mm,
because it's really alchemy that comes from these entheogens and having this relationship with this entheogens. Like you're saying, do a macrodose every couple, whatever feels appropriate to you, because that's what feels appropriate, because you're checking in with yourself. And so I feel everybody has this kind of alchemical recipe, whether it's DMT or iboga or ayahuasca or whatever it is, where they feel it's appropriate for them. And there's this vast amount of underground knowledge where everybody is kind of doing this alchemy. And so how can we kind of bring this knowledge into the forefront, into the culture, and bring it towards more of a, I like your setting and sustainability, right? I've heard you say that before. I like that. And so in a way, this alchemy kind of a consciousness is kind of the same way too, where it's this kind of a sustainable thing, is like an alchemical consciousness with it. To take the things that are negative in our life and move it to there. So, because it seems like right now there's, you do the psychedelics, or you're acquiring it, or you go through the clinical model, and then there's integration afterwards. But what happens after integration?
Yeah.
Well, we don't really know. Do you go back to integration again? Is it a 6 month thing? Is it a 1 year thing? So for people that have been doing this for years in recovery, like as much as like a bachelor's degree, right? You've been doing it for 4 years. What happens? What is this? Well, that I think it becomes alchemical at this point. It becomes an alchemical thing where you know how to do this, and you don't even need this the medicine. You don't even need to have the entheogen around, because you just know how to adapt this in your life and how to use this philosophy that you kind of use. And so that's kind of how I've done it over the past years. I've been like, wow, this is kind of like an entheogenic alchemy. And so I've shared that with other groups. I've kind of brought this up. I've kind of seen how everybody else has this alchemical thing. So I'm kind of wondering, how do they bring this undercurrent of this alchemical knowledge to the wider kind of a culture, um,
Yeah.
beyond integration, really, that there's like a beyond integration. It's kind of like a wider alchemical philosophy that you kind of encompass.
No, I love that. I love that. And it's a good reminder for all of us that, um, you know, after your first couple psychedelic experiences, a lot of what transpires is energetic. It's not in the form of language, which can make integration even trickier, because you come back and it's like, sometimes there just aren't written downloads to write down in your journal and to process with people. Sometimes it doesn't come in that form. It doesn't come in the form of English. It is an energetic transformation, or like you said, an alchemic, energetic, morphing from negative to positive, from inauthentic to authentic, from disattraction to attraction, in ways that, you really can't speak about, if and if you feel it, you feel it. And it's certainly been the case for me, and especially around addiction, so much of why I choose to stay clean and sober on a daily basis is energetic. It's because I don't want those negative energetic forces circulating through my consciousness and my bloodstream anymore. It's not just the behaviors, and of course, I don't want to live in Skid Row in Los Angeles, but it's much deeper than that on a cellular level. And I do think that over the course of time, various methods like psychedelics or breath work or meditation or whatever, do keep our energetic framework in a positive direction. So yeah, I love that philosophical approach to it, and I couldn't agree more. And I do agree that, after a while, I think medicine use does become less and less frequent, to the point of where, hey, maybe you can tap into that energetic transformation without the medicines. I do believe that. However, I do think our waking state of consciousness can sort of keep us sort of locked into the realities of what it means to be inside the meat suit. And now and then a theogenic journey can just snap us out of those things too, as a way to check in. But I love that. And I'd love to see that language continue to be used. That's great. Um, yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. Please head over to zachleary.net. And if I don't have your email address, just put it in the contact form there. Also, too, for those of you who are left, next month's topic, I don't have a topic yet. If you have any suggestions, I'm opening it up to the community too as well. Please email me, zachleary@mac.com. Happy to entertain ideas. And really can't thank you enough for being here. As I did mention before, just one last plug, my psychedelic studies intensive begins again on December 10th. Um, Go to zachleary.net/courses. There is one partial scholarship left. There's only a certain amount of them I can give, but there is one left, and please head over to my website and apply if you'd like that. And there's been a couple people here tonight who have taken the course, and great to see you guys. Um, Other than that, thank you everyone so much for coming, for your amazing, generous feedback, and really great to hang out with you guys. And stay on my mailing list. We'll do this again in November. So until then, you all have a great evening.